Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dardashe, a series where we talk to amazing and inspiring Palestinians about their lives and careers. Today, we're joined by Nasser Jaber, co-founder of the Migrant Kitchen. Nasser, thank you so much for being with us. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for your time, guys. This is wonderful. I'm so proud to be working with fellow Palestinians on Palestinian projects.
Amazing. You've been doing such amazing work, even now during COVID, and would love to talk about all of that. But I wanted to start with your journey. You're from a town near Ramallah. How did you
Turmus,
how did you end
no
up in New
turmus
York?
though.
Just
No, turmus but it doesn't have any turmus.
no Turmos. So why was it called Turmosaya?
So you'll get one version of the story where there was a Turkish guy that sold turmus and wanted to sell his land, and he was like Aya, so it became Turmus Aya. And then there are the Occidental Turmusawis who are obsessed with the West, and they want to be like a little bit modern. So they're like, oh, it's actually Terra Musa, which is the land of the Prophet. But then the settlers came, took the land based on that theory, and now they regret saying it. So
Oh no. Oh no. That's terrible.
yeah. So it's
That's
very
terrible.
funny.
Yeah. So I wanted to learn more about your journey from Turmosaya to New York, and how did you get into food?
Yeah, sure. I mean, getting into food was not intentional at all. And I didn't say that I had a connection with food. I mean, I grew up in a village. I hated olive harvest season. It was getting up in the morning early. It wasn't like fun, you know what I mean? And my mom was an awful cook. I mean, Allah yahmiha, but she's a really, really bad cook. She doesn't know how to cook anything. And as surprising, I'm probably the only Palestinian who hates wara and mahi. I hate it. I hate that dish.
You're being very blasphemous right now, Nasser.
Yeah,
You hate olive
exactly. It's
season.
insane,
You
right?
hate olive season.
Yeah.
You,
So,
yeah.
I wasn't your guy to get into food. And then I came to New York. I was, this is actually a very important part. So I went to the Friends, and the Friends, they have the upper class of society, but I wasn't from the upper class. I wasn't as rich. So whether I was able to talk about it and articulate it or not, I understood the division of classes really early on between the haves and the have-nots, right?
Mm-hmm.
People who have maids and private cars and they travel in the summer, and people who don't have ashra shekel for a sandwich, right? Anyways, I graduated, second intifada, come to New York. My parents are not rich, and unfortunately, my dad wasn't working for a while, so my mom was the only one who was the breadwinner in the family.
Mm-hmm.
She lost her job, and then there was no more money for the household. So I was on a scholarship upstate New York for computer engineering, but come 3 months later, I drop out of college and come down to the Bronx, to New York City. And then I started working on the street selling, back in the day, do you guys remember the clips for the cell phone that you put on your belt? And
Yeah.
so I used to sell those accessories. But I would always go hungry. I was working for under minimum wage, around maybe $5 an hour or $6 an hour. I was making like $300 a week working 12-hour days, right?
Mm-hmm.
So after my rent, I would sometimes have no food on Wednesday nights. Across the street, there's a cafe called Zaro's Bread and Basket. And Zaro's Bread and Basket is it's an okay cafe, whatever. It just sells bread and hot dogs and things like that. But there, a Dominican guy worked named Carlos. And this guy was like, if you want to eat, you should work in a restaurant because they give you something called family meal, which is basically they feed the staff. And I was like, oh, this is a great idea. I ended up working in a restaurant at a place called Dallas Barbecue. And Dallas Barbecue, it still exists till today. It's a very well-off to do restaurant, but it is probably the most awful, shittiest restaurant you'll ever go to. It has multiple locations. Everything comes out of a box. There's a lot of exploitation.
Sure.
But what's crazy about that restaurant dynamic is that its food it's a sit-down restaurant that's kind of pricey. Not pricey, but not more expensive than a McDonald's, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's only made for certain demographics who don't make more money than, let's say, $50,000 a year. So you go and you have a sit-down restaurant experience, but it's for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
But inside of it, you started learning about race and other factors that I was learning about in school, because I ended up going back to business school and learning about economics. I went to Baruch College, and that was also happening at the same time. The reason I went to Baruch College is that somebody I met said, I'm an investment banker, and he was making millions. I had no idea what investment banking is, and I wanted to do that. So I read a book about it, but the more that I studied economics and finance, I became much more of a leftist. It was hard for me to like really dig into labor when I know I'm being exploited, or immigration when I know I'm being exploited, or Palestine, or things like that, right? It's hard to justify these things. So the end result is that in the restaurant, I started learning more about the topics that I was getting in college than the textbook. Like, for example, when we talk about migration, you would have a lot of very capable doctors or engineers or what have you who fled their country because there's no food, there's nothing, there's no opportunities, and they end up working in restaurants because nobody recognizes their degrees, right? One of the food runners, that's the guy that goes between the kitchen and the table to bring the food, was a chemical engineer from the University of Mexico, right? Yeah. One of the packers was from, a doctor in Bangladesh. And it was very interesting because once a person gets into a restaurant in a certain division, then they start bringing people like their own. So at Dallas Barbecue, you had the Bengalis, they were the takeout department. The Mexicans were the cooks, the Africans from Senegal, whatever, were the waiters. The bartenders were all Colombian, right? It was an interesting dynamic. And across all New York City restaurants, these shifts end up happening to the point where right now we're like, coronavirus and everything else, and also more than that, just immigration. When Trump was talking about it against Mexicans, the entire industry would not run without Latinos, in particular Mexicans, right? Because no American is willing to work 12-hour days for that kind of pay.
Yeah.
Right. So
I wanted to ask you, Nasser. I recognize what you say. I have family in Berlin, and so when I go to Berlin, I see a lot of Palestinian and Syrian refugees.
And Turks, there's a lot of them doing that.
But in Berlin, the more recent waves have been, the Palestinian and the Syrian, and so they're just starting to try to fit in within society. And as you said, a lot of the doctors, the lawyers, etc., end up either working in the food industry or in transportation. So
absolutely, because it's easy access, right? It's easy access and it makes good pay. Like if you're a waiter in a restaurant, even if you didn't speak any English, in I'm not going to say across the country, but in Manhattan, in New York, you would make $60,000-$70,000 a year. That's like almost like a first-year graduate student job, right? Sometimes even more. There are certain restaurants, like the 5-star ones, like 11 Madison Park or Le Grenadine. Those are like very, very expensive restaurants where people spend $1,000 on a dinner for two. A waiter can make $120,000 a year. That's not bad. That's more than professionals sometimes, which is also a problem because it sucks you in.
Yeah, for sure.
It keeps you there. So when I got into this business, I graduated during the financial crisis afterwards, right? So imagine I come through 9/11, graduate to the financial, there's no jobs. I ended up getting stuck waiting tables for a long time, right? And working in kitchens for a long time. And I was miserable, right? Because, my father is like, "Batak America, عشان تصير garçon." You know what I mean? Like it was a whole, like it was an embarrassment and whatever. And it's also an embarrassment, like I'm going to say, like on the, look, الشغل مش عيب. I don't believe that, right? But I do think that if you want to be a part of a certain society, or if you want to be a part of a certain group, usually people mold into each other. Like, professionals will hang out with professionals, non-professionals hang out with non-professionals. Maybe there's some interaction, but for the most part, there's like certain cliques. In the restaurant industry, you're hanging out with everybody, right? And you're serving everybody and you're taking care of everybody. So like, as I saw my friends and family move on with careers, as I mentioned, doctors, lawyers, and engineers, I'm waiting tables. And the more that I stayed doing that, the more that I had no chance of entering a corporate America job or, like a regular job.
Sure.
And anyway, so what happens, and this happened, I think, a lot, and maybe now it's happening in Ramallah too, when people have nothing going on, but they still want to feel like they're part of something. They're like, oh, I have a startup, right? I mean, like, so that's what they do, right? Yeah. So I did a couple of startups. They were bullshit. Nothing happened. It failed. But then I learned a few things from them. Don't get me wrong, like nothing took
Sure.
off, but I learned a few things.
Sure.
And then I meet this guy named Dan Dorado, right, who is Mexican, who has 2 stars, who is now considered one of the best Middle Eastern chefs in the world, right?
Mhm.
But he's not Arab, right?
Sure.
And then he starts like introducing me to food in a way that I have not experienced before. And this is before Chef's Table. This is before all these things happened. Like Bourdain was around, but like only very few people saw him. You know what I mean? So
Sure.
like I remember when he brought in, as much as I hate like grape leaves, and all that stuff, he brought mahashi but made with bok choy. So I was like, well, that's blowing. What the hell is bok choy, right? And then he
Yeah.
started introducing me to different kind of food, different kind of fishes, different kind of stuff. And then I was watching the kitchen downstairs because the restaurant we were working in was a high-end restaurant. It worked like an orchestra. Imagine 100 people at the same
Yeah.
time, and sometimes they're all quiet, and the only thing that can be said is "Yes, chef." Right? It was a very beautiful sight to see. Right? And eventually, like because you're working in the restaurant industry, start knowing other people from the restaurant industry. As I mentioned, everybody gravitates to each other. People in the restaurant industry, maybe they don't have a lot of money, but they can get a lot of discounts at their restaurants. So all of a sudden you're going to this restaurant and that restaurant and trying this restaurant, you meet this chef and that chef, and everybody's trying a new stuff and what have you, right?
Nasser,
So
I wanted to ask you something about it's like a lot of your um, a lot of your a lot of what you were faced with within your move from Palestine to America, and some of your experiences with Palestine were rooted in class, and
absolutely,
that
some poverty.
seems to have
Yeah.
shaped a lot of your outlook in life. And so I wanted to ask also what it was like for you as a young Palestinian immigrant in a early 2000 America that saw probably Palestinians in a certain way and probably consumed a lot of what was happening during the Second Intifada.
Mm. Well, I have to say that being in the Bronx, I never felt any hate because
Mm.
Latinos and blacks saw us as like, yeah, like basically maybe they didn't have the intellectual capacity to articulate it, not because they're not intellectual, just simply because they don't know, right? But like if they see something on TV and they see an Israeli soldier beating a Palestinian kid, like the first thing they will say, oh, that's fucked up. Like why they're doing that. That's exactly what the
Mhm.
cops are doing to us here, right? It was just a very simple correlation, right? It
Yeah.
didn't have this depth. Like nobody read Edward Said, you know what I mean? So I didn't see a lot of hate. However, the Iraq War was, I think, for me, the turning point. It wasn't the Intifada and it wasn't 9/11. The Iraq War was a vilification of the Arab man, right?
Mm.
And a vilification of Arabs as like these terrorists, these this, these that, right? And it happened. And a lot of people don't want to look at this correlation, or I don't know if they would take it seriously, but when a population in the United States get vilified, it goes
Mm.
through a stages of absolute vilification and hatred and separation, but its food becomes popular, like the Japanese after World War II, right? And then eventually their culture
Mhm.
becomes cool too, right? With the exotification of their women first. And then
Mm.
it's a full acceptance, right?
So do you think we're in that stage, in that
Yeah, I believe
evolution?
so. I mean, we went from 9/11, nobody knew anything about us, right? All of a sudden, you have hummus and falafel becoming a thing.
Yeah.
And then it grew into Middle Eastern diet. And then, all these things happened that made people so oppressed that they had to organize, right? So that was the rise of the young Arab Americans who wanted to find their own identity. And with that, a lot of things came, a lot of political action came. And
Hmm.
that paved the way for Nur al-Qat, Nasser Jaber, I mean, you name it, right? A lot of the leaders that you see today, that wasn't overnight. That was like 15 years of grassroots organization. Regardless of you, like them or don't, align with them or don't. I mean, that was the case. And then the Trump administration came, and then the rise of the Arab narrative, the Palestinian narrative, has become even more popular than I would say in the Arab world,
Mm.
right? You have members in the American Congress talking about how they should not work with Israel or boycott Israel, and you have Arab governments in for normalization, right? Like
Yeah.
the paradigm is shifting, right?
Yeah.
And we were very much part of that movement on like, I mean, my team, and in terms of like the food process, right? So before I started working with Dan Dorado, I worked at a company called Le Pain Quotidien. Le Pain Quotidien was just opening up, kind of like a higher end Starbucks from Belgium. And they had the racist tendencies. All the back of house were Africans or Moroccans, very French, very Belgian, right? And all the front of house were Belgian and European, right? Which is really racist. But besides the point, they were blowing up, they're expanding, and they were hitting it off. And then I started working in business development. I was the only I would say white in the entire company, in the corporate office. And one of my first projects was I needed to buy mint. So I was able to get on Palestine Fair Trade and buy Palestinian mint for all 54 locations. Now, let me tell you something. I had no desire to do social impact. I did not really understand the depth of what I was doing, right? I was just a young kid. But some guy was like, oh, check this Palestinian mint out. You should bring it to your store. And I'm like, you know what? That's a great idea. I want Palestinian mint in the store, right? And it was as simple as that. There was no like depth to it. And the price was right. The product was great. And now every time an American or a New Yorker bought a mint lemonade from Le Pain Quotidien across all 54 locations, they were buying Palestinian mint. And that right. And that was the first access to food empowerment. And the guy who hired me is Christoph Mars. And this all comes together. Like, remember Carlos, remember Christoph Mars, because once we get to the last point, like you'll see how it all fell in some sort of beautiful way together, right? So then I worked with Dan. I learned a lot about food, but I got engaged, and I got engaged to a beautiful Palestinian girl. Unfortunately, I went through, I guess, what a lot of like the shabab go to, like when like you don't get engaged, like financial insecurity become a thing. Like, I'm a waiter, right? How am I going to provide for this woman? Like, how am I going to have a house? How am I going to have a family? Like, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm older, right? And there was a lot of tension, not because we didn't love each other, but because of the financial insecurity. And that led to the demise of the relationship. And although that same scenario happened before, I was never in love enough to be like, oh, it actually mattered. I was with other women, they're like, oh my God, what are you doing in your life? You're working in restaurants. Like, but like nobody really talked about this. And on top of all of this, I'm bipolar. I'm on medication, right? I have vitiligo, as you can see, that comes from like manic depression. And I had no idea what that is until, I don't know if you know PCRF. Do you know these guys?
No.
The Palestinian Children Relief Fund. They're the ones that work. So the Palestinian Children Relief Fund is an organization that works with kids who are like either like hurt or shot or whatever by the Israelis, and they would send doctors for rescue missions. So they're the ones who came and told me what that is when I was a kid. Like, I had no idea, right?
Sure.
And restaurants, unfortunately, allow your depression and mania to keep going because you're making money every night. There's a lot of alcohol. There's a lot of drugs. Everybody's like, it's a party. Everybody's sleeping with everybody. Everybody's like, I mean, can we say this on tape or should I like not do that?
You can say whatever you want. Say whatever you want.
There's a lot of partying that's happening. And unfortunately, you can get sucked into a black hole and never come out of it. There's people that work in the industry 20, 30 years and they haven't accomplished anything, right? And I felt I was going through that track until a friend of mine that I love to death, Salah Zalatimo, came. And he's from the Zalatimo family. And he was like, I want to open a restaurant. And I don't have time to run it, so you run it. And I thought this was my chance, right? This was the chance to save my relationship and build something. And I've already been in this industry for a long time. I know exactly what to do. So when we opened this restaurant, the idea was to open a Palestinian Latino restaurant. And we took over the famous, because there's a lot of Palestinians in Chile. And in our balad, a lot of people eat Chilean food and drink mate. I mean, like that's, they're fallahin, right? How would they know that if it hasn't been
pretty crazy. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. So eventually, the place used to be owned by a famous chef called Eddie Wong. And Eddie Wong exactly. So Eddie Wong had the place. And then I was like, wait, if he was here and he made it, then I'm going to make it too. But I didn't really realize that he didn't make it. He just wrote a book that became famous. That was a thing that we learned down the road. And then he was able to build a successful restaurant, but not from that location. But we didn't know this. So we started the restaurant. The restaurant had great reviews, but it was losing $8,000 a month.
Mm.
Like, so now not only that I'm not making enough money, I'm not making any money at all. I'm living on debt. Like, so it was a lot of stressful things, whatever the case may be. And the relationship was falling apart. But then I get a call from UNRWA. Trump just came to power and he was like, I'm banning the Muslims, whatever. So they had the Syrian guy that was the last person to enter that had no job, nothing to do. And he was going to be homeless because in the United States, unlike Europe or Canada, they only give you 2 months to like get on your feet, not 13.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's nothing. And it's New York, like what the hell are they going to give you? $300?
2 months to find a job and settle down in a foreign
There's
country?
no way you can do that. No way, right? I think it's especially when they don't speak the language, right? So it was like 2-3 months and it was nothing. So having said that, I was like, already Chef's Table was out. It was the first season. That's before it became popular around the world. And I saw them doing a lot of communal dinners. And Le Pain Quotidien used to be proud because in every restaurant they had a big communal table. So I went and got a communal table. And I used to make the restaurant break even, I used to host a dinner called From Ramallah to Bogota, which showcased Palestinian diaspora in Colombia.
Amazing.
Right? So I had all the ingredients, right? And I was like, I can make Syrian food. Why don't this guy come in, just cook a Syrian meal, and I'll sell the tickets. I'm already selling them. And we already sold the store. That's it. The store is now failing. We're done now. And we have 3 months to give the key to the other person. That was part of the deal. So I have nothing to lose. خلينا نعمل these dinners, make him $1,000. خليه يستأجر شقة. My best friend is a pro-Palestinian Jewish guy who is a big Broadway writer. So he came to the first dinner. He wrote Moulin Rouge.
Okay.
And he's like, Nasser, Americans love happy ending. This is a very sad story. We need to redo this in the Hollywood way. So what does that mean? That means he had to tell his story, the same story, but like in the positive way. We're like, I'm now here to fight and keep going. Not like, Mishan, Allah help me, right?
Yeah.
And then he brought a couple of people and then it blew up. It became a thing. All of a sudden we realized that a lot of people were booking tickets, and that was okay. We were making money to give it to him. But the power wasn't the tickets. The power was people at the table whom he could ask for something like an apartment or a job, because he was able to get a job and an apartment. So eventually, all in all, without getting into too much details for time's sake, we ended up feeding 5,000 people and lifting 200 families out of poverty. And the program exploded into Turkey and Sweden and Morocco, and it was a thing. And then it was adopted by the State Department to become part of gastrodiplomacy, right? Which is now a term that we coined and we started doing actual real diplomatic solutions with food. Okay. So that happened, but again, the relationship is falling apart. We sold the restaurant. I'm $100,000 in debt. I'm back in the restaurant, and we break up, and I become homeless, right? So, it's like I'm really depressed. I don't know what to do. I'm struggling with suicide, and I talk about that openly, and it's important, to talk about these things. And then, it was very tough. But then Dan, who is my mentor, comes and tells me, look, Nasser, you did all these amazing things, but they didn't make you any money. Let's just do a small catering company, right? Nothing fancy. It doesn't take you to South by Southwest. It doesn't take you on the front pages of the newspapers, but it will get you a place to stay, right? So we started doing it, and I was so depressed I didn't cook anything. He would just bring me to wash dishes just to get me out of bed, right? So we started doing it out of a small place, and our first customer was WeWork, the co-sharing space. And we went from 1 location to 25. There was nothing fancy about it. We're just delivering lunch and cooking, right? Eventually, coronavirus hits, and I have 1,000 meals in my fridge, right? But I don't have a place to put them. There's no freezer. So they're going to go bad. So me and Dan are driving in a truck. We just started this company 3 months ago. We're failing again. I'm like, here we go. I just got a room, and not even an apartment. I just got a room, with other people. And now I'm going to be homeless again, right? And then he goes like, I don't know what we're going to do, man. So I was like, I don't know, but let's just give this food out because people need it. So the shelters that I was staying in, when I was staying in the shelter, called me, like they needed food. So we give them food. But then a friend of mine who's a doctor at one of the best cancer hospitals in the country called me. It's like, all the restaurants closed and we're hammered in the ER. Can you send us food? So I went and I gave the entire ER food. She wanted only for a few people, but then I ended up giving the whole ER. Though somebody told their friends at another hospital, and then I gave them, and then another hospital, and then I gave them, and all of a sudden, like, because I have so many plates, right? And this is all within like 2 days. All of a sudden, wow. MSNBC picks up the story. So we go on MSNBC and we announce that we're feeding the healthcare workers, and that became an international trend. Overnight, we raised $100,000, and now we're feeding the hospitals. So now we're back working again, right? We're hiring people, right? Which was great, where we have the donations, we're hiring people, making the food, and we're giving it for free to the doctors. Eventually, World Central Kitchen, which is Jose Andreas, comes in and says, hey, you know, I've seen you on Eddie Wong's show. Like, you know, like, I know what you're doing. We're connected here and there. We would like to take over the hospitals. And I was like, no problem. But in exchange, you give me the right to feed the poor Muslim community, right? Mm-hmm. Even though myself, I'm not religious, and, you know, I'm not religious at all. But the Bengali, Pakistani, and Muslim community in Jackson Heights is in dire poverty, right? So they need to eat. And nobody cares about them. So he's like, no problem. So we basically switched, right? They're like, you took the hospitals, I do this, and whatever the case may be. He wanted the hospitals under his name. Sure, no problem. So it worked out. And eventually we were now doing like from 1,000 meals a day to 15,000 a day, right?
Wow.
And then I was like, you know, and then on May 7th, so a lot of crazy stuff happened that day. First of all, my dad died.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Allah yarhamu. Endings, beginnings. And then the Washington Post puts out a big piece calling me the Palestinian Anthony Bourdain. And then the mayor of New York City calls us and gives us our first government contract because they want us to scale from 15,000 meals a day to like 100,000 because there was real food insecurity in New York. And we were the only ones hiring immigrants, paying them good money in big kitchens, and had efficiency. Like it was almost like a military operations. It requires its own podcast and how we built it. Like we had some guy from Uber, this, logistics, like all the failures of the past 10 years came together, right? And our head chef is Carlos's sister, who was a young kid from years ago. And the guy who gave us bread was Christoph, the guy who hired me at La Banquet de Diane. So all these things come together at the end. You know, Dan is running it with me. So anyway, we end up.
Well, just to ask, Nasser. So the Migrant Kitchen essentially provided food to communities in need during Corona and employed migrants to deliver that.
At 20 to 25 an hour, we were paying them above the minimum wage, and that was the something. And we also gave restaurant quality food. Like people, we were not giving like bologna sandwiches, right? We feed people with respect.
And can I ask you, the reason you hired the migrants was after your experience with Norwa and the Syrian?
Also my experience myself as a migrant. We all got exploited. And when this hit and the government started giving a lot of unemployment insurance to people, you know, immigrants pay taxes but don't get any unemployment insurance. There was no food. And don't forget, they all work in restaurants. Everything shut down. The food lines, like where you take food for free, was over the top. So I started selling basically food to the government and taking some of that money and then feeding the people that didn't fall within the government, like they were ghosts in the system, right? And then I was like, I want to do this for Palestine. So we started feeding the Augusta Victoria or the Muttala Hospital. So me, Fadi Kattan, Hani Qattan, like the PACES organization, we got together and we started feeding the Muttala. And then I was like, I want to feed Beirut. So we started in Beirut before the explosion, right? And then we started doing the same process, you know, let's cook meals and send it. And the explosion happened. Of course, there was more attention now, right? So now we scaled up and we did 25,000 wajbeh in Shatila. Then we went to Shatila, right? And we started seeing like, okay, if I give a family of 4 a box of food for a month, they don't have to take their kids out of like school to yishhatu b'shara, right? Because like, this is where we are in terms of poverty. We are so poor that people are on the street, not ishhatting for Gucci bags, you know, they're ishhatting for food, right? So if I give them 3 respectful meals per person a day, continuously every day, then that little money that they have, they can keep their kids in school, they can keep this, they can do that. And then, you know, sometimes we have to work within the politics and the logistics, right? Like it's expensive for me to feed in Jerusalem, but it's cheap for me to feed in Beirut because the dollar goes a long way. It's cheap to feed in Bangladesh, but it's very expensive to feed in London. You know what I mean? Like, so it's a dynamic that we have to work with. And I guess we have now grown to a company that is 100 employees, operates in 3 countries. We are one of the largest disaster relief missions in the world. We have a retail side as well, where like, you know, you come in and buy a meal and give a meal for free, like a small restaurants, but we're not really a restaurant. We're like operational missions, right? We go with tents and potable water, with refrigerated trucks. Like, we know how to operate not just in pandemics, but in war zones. Like, we are even talking about like, how do we feed Yemen? Do we go on airlift? Kind of like what they did with like the Marshall Plan, you know, in Germany. And all these kind of things. And we understand that food insecurity is so high that if we are able to feed people, then they can have some sort of self-determination for their future. So I'm happy to announce that come February in Palestine, we will build the first, I think would be, I haven't done my research, so don't quote me on that. The first culinary kitchen in Termos Aya, which will be the hub to feed all Palestinian kids kindergarten to the 6th grade for free, nutritious meals. And we're going to start with the Khirbat Abu Falah, Namghayr, you know, poor villages. And I would like to go throughout the entire West Bank. So if I'm feeding every single Palestinian kid, right, then they will send them to school. Yeah. Because people don't send their kids to school simply because there's no food.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's amazing. Listen, thank you for sharing your incredible story with us. We you know, you captured everything you are doing and amazingness. And yeah, let us know when you're in Palestine. It'd be amazing to connect.
I would love to. Yeah, I'm hoping to come in as soon as, like, because I haven't seen my mother since the passing. So like, I'm trying to go to. But the only thing that I would like to make very clear to the Palestinian community is that the Migrant Kitchen and its entire team is standing by to feed every hungry Arab, and in particular, every hungry Palestinian, wherever they may be. So our operations are continuing in Shatila and Mukhaymat Lebanon, and also the other Mukhaymat after 67 that are not considered Mukhaymat, so we're definitely there as well. And we're going to be definitely in the West Bank, and we hope, we're trying to figure out a way to go into Gaza. So we'll figure out. And the goal is, can we do, you know, millions of meals a day in Palestine? We will be doing it here during the election. We're going to be doing 3 million meals in 10 states the day of the election.
Amazing.
So we can definitely scale, but we hope that we can, you know, empower our people. So
all the power to you. All the power to you. Thank you, man. So really appreciate you taking the time. And
thank you, guys.
Yeah, hit us up when you're in Palestine.
I will, for sure. Thank you again.
Take care.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.